Saturday morning, the Experts program kicks off on Power Talk Radio, and our tech expert, Luis Alvarez, CEO of the Alvarez Technology Group, with us right now. Hello, Luis.
Hello, Mark. How are you today?
Doing very well and looking forward to a really interesting topic for the program, and this has to do with the United States Navy envisioning the use of hundreds of thousands of drones in the Pacific as a means of deterring China. And I'm wondering, I remember that the Navy started kind of using drones back in the 80s as spotters for the World War II battleships. You remember when they brought back the Iowa-class battleships?
Yep, I do. I do remember that. They brought them back for the Gulf War, I think.
Yeah, they were all through the 1980s.
Wanted to be able to launch big giant shells at the bad guys.
Yeah, and they said that these ships had these drones. They were much larger than the kinds of drones that we're talking about today, but they were these UAVs, unmanned aircraft. They had equipment on them that acted like range finders for the fire control people using the big guns in the turrets. And they were very small, and they were powered, I think, by like a lawnmower type engine. But you could control them with a joystick from like somewhere on the bridge, and you would send that drone out, and it would go out, and it would be up in the sky, well up above whatever your potential target was, and it would transmit back the range distance data to fire control, and then they would use it to plot the angle of the gun and how much gunpowder they were going to use and so forth, so that those 2,000-pound shells could hit their target. So that, as I recall, was maybe the first use of drones in the Navy, going back to the 1980s. But what we're talking about now is something much more sophisticated and a lot smaller. Talk about this for us.
Yeah, so this is a consequence of 2 years of war between Ukraine and Russia, and we've seen how impactful drones have been, and not just aerial drones, but the Ukrainians have been very innovative in using ground drones, like basically small tanks that have been outfitted with munitions and that could go right into a Russian troop formation and detonate. So having these capable, standoff weapons has really impressed the United States military, and all the services are, scrambling to incorporate drones and AI into their arsenal. But in particular, the Navy faces a real challenge in the Pacific with China growing its fleet, whereas the U.S. Navy has to spread itself across all the oceans because of the commitments that we have. China has the luxury of kind of consolidating all of their naval assets in one area. And so in order to combat a numerically superior opponent, the United States is looking at using, like you said, hundreds of thousands of drones as devices, not necessarily as offensive weapons, but as weapons to deny certain battle space to China should, hostilities ever break out. So imagine the Taiwan Straits, for example, that area of the sea between Taiwan and China. Should there ever be a shooting war, that becomes a real heated area, and we don't want to send our carriers and our big ships in there because they're going to be targeted and despite all the defenses, probably be disabled to some extent.
Right.
But if you could send thousands of drones instead that could be used to fight the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Air Force, it's a game changer. So the Navy and, like I said, all the military services are looking at the lessons that are being learned every day in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine and saying, hey, we need to incorporate some of that into our new battle space program.
In a way, it's like asymmetrical warfare tactics, because generally the biggest military tends to be more wedded to the most traditional strategies, and the smaller adversary that doesn't have the resources, well, they typically are the ones that try to be more nimble, try to use newer technologies to somewhat level that playing field and get into what they call that asymmetrical warfare. So it's interesting to see the United States delving into that rather than staying with a more traditional outlook. One of the interesting things about this and what kind of drives this as well is that the fleet, as you mentioned, we have a lot of places where the United States Navy is expected to be at any one time. And I believe we have 325 ships in the fleet, but at any one time, 1/3 are in port, 1/3 are in the yard for renewal, refurbishment, and then that leaves 1/3 that are actually on patrol. So maybe just a little over 100 ships, not 325, are on the world's oceans at any one time representing the United States and our interests. And 100 ships is not a lot to cover all the world's oceans.
It is not, no. And the thing that makes this possible now is is, going back to the description that you had of those earlier drones that were being remotely controlled, you can't do that with thousands of drones, right? It's just impossible to have that many drones up in the air being managed one-on-one by somebody. So using AI technology and the automation that we have available to us today means that you can have drones that are synchronized to do certain things and respond to certain threats on their own based on their programming without having a human being intervene. And so you can flood the zone, so to speak, with a bunch of these drones that can act as a self-defense force and actively fight on your behalf without having to be directly controlled.
So how are those drones communicated with? Is it via our military satellites?
Yeah, so it'll be satellite, depending on distance to the target. It'll be using traditional radios, encrypted radio streams, but largely it would be satellite communications, because those can't be blocked, and you can have satellites positioned anywhere in the world and be able to control those drones. Of course, electronic warfare will also be part of what you have to consider. So a lot of those signals the enemy will be trying to jam. So that's why it's critical that these drones are programmed to be able to act in some fashion independently, so that if they do lose communications, they don't just fall out of the sky or stop their forward progress. They have to be able to be programmed to fight independently, so to speak, if communications aren't available.
Right. And one of the things we have to be wary of, one of the technologies that China has been working on are satellite killing missiles that they can fire into space to destroy our military satellites, which would effectively make all those drones blind.
Right.
If there was any sort of backup control for these, that would be, say, HALO, high altitude, low orbit, or something like that control. Obviously, the Navy isn't going to tell us, but that is a consideration that you have to be thinking about, how robust this is, because that's one of the areas that China has been working on, are satellite killer missiles. And then you mentioned earlier about not wanting to send certain capital ships into harm's way. We don't have that many of them, particularly aircraft carriers. I believe we have 10 aircraft carriers in the fleet now, and for many years we had 13. We had 12 carriers that were available and one that was a training carrier in Pensacola. Now we're down to 10. And actually one carrier, the carriers rotate in to Pensacola for training of new aviators, so that means you actually have 9. But the Chinese have developed carrier-killing missiles, and these are specially designed to be able to bore through the reinforced steel deck on an American aircraft carrier and actually go all the way through and out the bottom and break the keel in two and sink the ship that way. So that is something that, and these have existed. We first learned about these carrier-killing missiles about 10 or 15 years ago. They were written about in Proceedings and some of the other military magazines where they talk about strategies and defense issues and so forth. Mm-hmm. So that's a real concern, because obviously over that period of time, the Chinese have been perfecting those missiles. And one of the things that we did a number of years ago in, I think, the mid-2000s, in the first decade, was we actually took one of our older carriers, the SS America, and we took it out off the coast of Virginia, and it was part of a SYNC-X exercise where we hit it with all manner of weaponry to see how long it would take to sink it. It took a couple days, and it went down, and I believe it's in like 16,000 feet of water. It was deliberately sunk in 16,000 feet of water, because there isn't anything that anyone owns that can go that deep and retrieve it or retrieve parts of it and so forth. But the Navy did that along with the defense contractors in order to build the next generation of better carriers. So the Gerald Ford class, which is our newest, which is the class that's replacing the Nimitz class of nuclear carriers, the Ford class has many of the lessons learned from the SYNC-X exercise on the America built into them.
Yeah, and that's what war teaches you, right, is all these lessons of how the landscape changes. Like you pointed out, it seems like most militaries are ready to fight the last war they fought, and it's always the upstarts who develop new ways to look at it, because they don't have the same force structure that they can count on. And if you look at the war in Ukraine, it speaks to how the Ukrainian military was able to hold off the vast Russian forces using innovative technologies and new ways of thinking, including drones. And I think we just just need to take those lessons and apply them now instead of waiting for the next war.
And for anyone who wants to learn more about this, I know you'll have a link on your website. It's also available at a website called defense1.com, and you can find the story there. Luis Alvarez has been our guest. Online, you'll find them at alvareztg.com, at alvareztg. That is the X handle. And Luis, the toll-free number for the I-Team.
Give us a call at 866-78-I-TEAM. That's 866-784-8326.
And, of course, join us on Monday, starting at 8:30 in the morning for our tech updates on Mondays with Luis Alvarez. And we're going to be talking about facial recognition technology coming to an airport near you, and it will make boarding faster for people. And we'll talk about that on Monday's program. So, Luis, thanks for the update today, and we're looking forward to chatting with you again on Monday. And I hope you and Ronnie have a great rest of the weekend.
You too, my friend. Take care.